We carried more than just a code. We carried the past. Thousands of years of history, never written down, a language that survived deserts and canyons, untouched by the European fever. Now, that past had to become our future. We sat in the steel belly of the tank landing ship, LST, the waves of the Pacific methodically beating the hull, and I felt the vibration travel through my hands gripping the headset. This wasn't the silence that comes before sleep. This was the silence that lies. The silence concealing a darkness ready to consume everything we held dear. If we messed up a single inflection, a regiment would die. If I spoke HI, duck, instead of NASOSI, mouse, friendly fire would rain down. This wasn't a war against tanks or artillery pieces. This was a war against my own throat, against my exhaustion, against my fear that in a critical moment, my mind would tangle in 3 languages at once: the English I'd learned to serve, the military English, full of acronyms, and Dine Bizad, the people's language, which we had forged into the most reliable and terrifying weapon of this war. I was 20. I didn't know how men died. I knew how to speak. Inside our small, armored compartment, the air hung heavy with the smell of diesel, damp uniform wool, and the acrid stench of cheap tobacco trying to mask the creeping nausea of the sea. Outside, beyond the sealed porthole, the ocean slept, promising to deliver us tomorrow to the hell they called Iwo Jima. I wiped the microphone membrane. Fine salt crystals corroded the copper, but they dared not touch my voice. My voice had to be pure, like spring water from the mountain mesa. Beside me sat Billy Johnson, another man from the Chinle Reservation. His face was carved from granite. He wasn't nervous. He was simply cleaning his M1 carbine and waiting. There were only 4 of us on this ship. 4, and our task was to ensure that thousands of white Americans didn't kill themselves in the chaos awaiting us. We weren't just radio operators. We were living cipher machines. I put on the headset and tuned the frequency. Only a quiet, steady hiss. I closed my eyes and whispered into the darkness. "Shima, y'all." My mother. The code was both simple and impossible. It was simple because it was our native tongue, which had no alphabet and was incomprehensible to any white man except those trained to use it. It was impossible because we had to invent nearly 400 new words. Bomber, Jad Holan NIH, buzzard. Tank, Chedagahi, turtle. Our language, which once described deer and prairie dogs, now described death by air and steel. I ran through the memorized list again. Submarine, CityNet AI, iron fish. Grenade, NI Most Sand, potato. Machine gun, NICHA, the fast shooter. I knew the Japanese cryptographers were the best in the world. They could break any German code, any British code. They could read our letters intercepted over the radio. But they couldn't break something that wasn't written. They couldn't break a culture they considered primitive. I felt a tremor. It wasn't the ship. It was my body, knowing what was coming next. Major Riley, the communications officer, was a man whose belief in order bordered on religious fanaticism. He didn't understand our code, he didn't understand Navajo, but he understood statistics. Since we started operating, communication losses had dropped nearly to 0, and transmission speed had increased tenfold. To him, we were a miracle instrument. An instrument that must operate flawlessly. "Yazzie! Johnson! Last run through!" His voice, amplified by the radio set, cut through the heavy air of the compartment. We stood instantly alert and focused. "This is a simulation, sons. But if you botch this simulation, imagine what happens tomorrow. The stakes, the 5th Division." Sergeant Brown, my bodyguard, a sturdy white guy from Texas, armed with a Browning automatic rifle and perpetually grim, stood in the doorway, his eyes darting between us and the major. Brown was assigned to us not only for protection from the Japanese, but also for protection from ourselves, should one of us ever decide that the secret was more important than the duty. We were too valuable to risk. Message number 1. Report tactical priority shift. Include artillery coordinates and the new word designation for the B-29 heavy bomber. Riley dictated. I took the headphones and began decoding. Starting with Nakizili, our Aka, blood, Diazi mixed, standard opening, for identity confirmation. The new word. I tensed up. We had agreed upon it 3 days ago, but in battle, new words are born from chaos. We had to be flexible. A Josh or axe, that meant. Battalion. B-29, Natsali, Eagle, very large. But that was too general. Riley wanted specificity. He dictated the new, narrow word, Tzih, the very large owl. I felt my heart drop. Tzih. I knew it, but it didn't stick to my tongue like Natsali. A second pause, my brain, overloaded with fatigue, stalled. I couldn't remember the correct conjugation of the word in the transmission context. Yazzie! What's the delay? Riley's voice sharpened like a whip crack. I swallowed the bitterness and forced it out. Tzih. The message went through. I checked the clock. For seconds delay. Riley snatched the headset from my hands. His face was crimson. For seconds, Yazzie? For seconds. That's an artillery volley. That's 10 men who die while you try to remember what your great-grandmother called a bird. Do you understand what speed means on the island? This isn't Guadalcanal. The Japanese aren't waiting here. They've dug themselves into the earth, and they're waiting for you to make a mistake. I stayed silent. He didn't understand. It wasn't a mistake. It was the cost of perfection. For him, it was a communication system. For me, it was my people, whom I had to turn into a bullet. Brown placed a hand on my shoulder. Heavy, but steadying. Settle down, Navajo. You'll be faster tomorrow. Either you're a corpse or they are. Your choice. I nodded. There was no choice. When we landed, the world exploded. I will never forget that smell. The stench of diesel fuel mixed with sulfur, volcanic ash, and burning flesh. We knew the island was called Iwo Jima, or Sulphur Island, but nothing prepared me for the sheer density of that corrosive air. It coated everything, my teeth, my lungs, the cold metal of the radio. The landing crafts, LVT, ground onto the black, loose volcanic sand. It was a cruel deception. The sand was too soft for vehicles to gain purchase, but too hard to dig into for cover. Every step was an exhausting, sinking effort. We were tasked with following the initial wave, carrying a medium-range radio set, SCR-300. The plan was meticulous. Secure the beachhead, establish communications, and then drive inland. The plan lasted exactly 17 minutes. The moment the ramps dropped, the island woke up. The Japanese weren't on the beach, they were inside the island, in concrete bunkers and hidden caves, waiting for the beach to fill with American flesh and steel. The noise wasn't just loud, it was physical. It hammered my skull, vibrated my teeth. It was a solid, continuous wall of sound made of machine gun fire, the 9CHA, mortar rounds, the NIMOST sand, and heavy artillery. The Marines around us were immediately pulverized. Men who had been joking seconds earlier dissolved into crimson mist and flying metal fragments. I saw a flamethrower team vanish in a direct hit from a mortar. Move! Yazzie! Move! Billy screamed, his voice thin against the roar. We dropped our gear and began sinking into the black sand. My boots felt like lead weights. Suddenly, a massive explosion erupted 20 feet to our left. It wasn't the shriek of incoming artillery. It was the sickening thud of a Japanese knee mortar, a close-range weapon the dying Bizad had yet to name. perhaps Ashjayalti, the talking pebble. I felt a sharp, burning heat and was thrown forward. I landed face first in the hot ash. For a second, there was only a ringing silence. When my hearing returned, the first thing I saw was Sergeant Brown. His body lay twisted over the wreckage of our primary communication pack, the SCR-610. He had taken the brunt of the blast. The heavy Browning lay uselessly beside him. He wasn't breathing. We were alone. The equipment was gone. The white man who was supposed to ensure our safety and our silence was dead. Billy grabbed my arm, his eyes wide but focused. "The 300! We keep the 300! They need the coordinates for the heavy batteries!" He was right. We had a portable set, our last link. The main objective was gone, but the secondary mission, establishing communication with the artillery to crush the firebases, was now the only mission. The air smelled of ozone and fresh blood. The sand, already hot from the volcanic heat, was now burning from the sheer volume of ordnance hitting it. We had to move, not toward the enemy, but through the enemy's field of fire, toward the ridge line of Mount Suribachi, where the command post was supposed to be established. The plan was dust. Our future was measured in seconds. The landing zone was a slaughterhouse. We pushed inland, following the desperate, confused thrust of the Marines. Every few yards, we had to flatten ourselves as another wave of shrapnel ripped through the air. The SCR-300 was heavy, cumbersome, and strapped to my back. It felt like I was carrying an anvil forged from ancestral stone. "We need higher ground, Chayton. We can't transmit from this ditch," Billy yelled, motioning toward a slight rise crowned by jagged, black rock formations. As we ran, I began receiving faint, frantic messages in English over the headset, the standard Marine Corps radio traffic. It was a torrent of panic, static, and unconfirmed location reports. "Dog Company is pinned. Requesting fire support at grid 4 to 7. We need medics. I repeat, medics for Fox 3. We can't get the tanks off the beach, goddammit. They're stuck in the ash." This chaos was exactly why we existed. If this standard English traffic continued, the entire operation would dissolve into an uncoordinated disaster. Their communications were failing. Ours had to be the rock they clung to. We reached the base of the rock formation. It was a jumble of ancient lava flows, providing momentary, precarious cover. "Billy, I need to get a burst out. Tell them we're operational and demand priority for the counter-battery fire request." Billy took his position, covering me with his carbine. I quickly set up the whip antenna. I turned the crank to power the radio, the low, grinding sound feeling dangerously loud in the momentary lull of direct fire. I tapped the key. Nakizuli Akadazi. Confirmation protocol. Then the message, Nahaz and Nahati Island, hot, angry. We invented this word last night. Ga Rabbit, Recon, reporting operational. I immediately received a response from a distant, clear voice. The artillery command ship, waiting offshore. They were ready. My first mission, targeting the Japanese mortar positions that had decimated the beach. I had to use the grid map, translate the coordinates into our code. Each number had a corresponding animal or object. 1 equals wolf, 2 equals bear, 3 equals cat, and transmitted with blinding speed. Adine, artillery, Gateli, coordinates, hasty and Dutsai, blue man, 4, shush, bear, 2, tle, night, 7. I spoke rapidly, the language flowing not from my conscious mind, but from some deep, primal instinct. The words were ancient, but their purpose was ultramodern. Seconds later, the earth shuddered. Not from an incoming shell, but from a deafening, distant barrage leaving the control ship. The shells screamed overhead and slammed into the rocks behind the beach, precisely where the mortars had been firing from. A dark, smoking cloud replaced the jagged silhouette. The Marines nearby cheered, a weak, desperate sound. We saved them. But we weren't safe yet. A runner, a young Marine with wide, terrified eyes, stumbled toward our position. "Radio men! Sir! The KP isn't here!" The command post was hit immediately. "Colonel Cates is setting up an emergency communications center near the base of Suribachi. You need to get there. He needs constant fire control. It's half a mile up, through the worst of it." My heart sank. Not just a dash, but a climb. Up the side of the volcano, where every rock was a potential machine gun nest. "We move now," Billy stated, adjusting his carbine. "We are the only ones talking to the ships. They can't afford to lose us." I hefted the radio. The burden felt heavier now, charged with the lives we had just saved. We were tasked with climbing a mountain of ash and death, powered only by the resilience of an unwritten language. The climb up the lower slopes of Suribachi was a nightmare of vertical effort. The volcanic soil offered no grip, and every step was agonizing. We moved through a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon, black, hostile, and utterly devoid of life. The Japanese resistance wasn't based on holding lines. It was based on waiting in silence. They were the stone rats, hidden in a labyrinth of tunnels and reinforced concrete pillboxes, a dune fortification, we called it. We followed a disorganized column of exhausted Marines. They moved slowly, their faces grim, stepping over bodies that were already starting to turn stiff and gray. We paused behind a massive, angular slab of black lava. I heard the unmistakable chattering of a Japanese Nambu machine gun nearby. The bursts were short, precise, and deadly. It was firing from a camouflaged aperture in the rock wall 20 yards away. The Marines ahead were pinned down, unable to pinpoint the source. I was the spotter. I had to be. "Give me the radio, Billy. They need eyes right now." I ducked behind the rock, pulling out the handset. I didn't even need to contact command. I broadcasted directly on the preset artillery frequency, demanding a fast adjustment. "Hello, St. Ichigo, rock/hardened surface." I started, referring to the heavy cruiser USS Chester, waiting offshore. "This is GA, Recon, requesting suppression fire. Range 30 meters, bearing 040. Target, a dune fortification." I quickly gave the coded coordinates for the rock. I couldn't afford to calculate the fire trajectory. I only had time to describe the geometry of the target relative to our position using our improvised spatial code. COS, cloud/above, Nilchai, wind/flanking, TLO, grass/below. "Nilchai Yadun Haloni," flanked the fortification. I threw myself flat just as the sound arrived. Not the shell itself, but the crump of the heavy guns firing miles away. The response time was phenomenal, perhaps 30 seconds from my lips to the impact. The cruiser's shells landed exactly where I had designated. The volcanic rock around the position exploded, and the Nambu fell silent. A plume of dust and steam rose from the smoking gap. The Marines surged forward, scrambling over the ruined position. A tall, exhausted lieutenant looked back at me, his eyes hollowed out by fear and combat. He didn't thank me. He just nodded, a slight, grim acknowledgement of the impossible power I wielded. We moved on. I realized something profound in that moment. The effectiveness of the code wasn't just its unbreakability. It was its speed. No encryption machine could encode, transmit, and decode data that quickly. My voice, my ancestral language, was faster than electricity. We finally reached the emergency command post, dug haphazardly into the side of the mountain, hidden beneath a few layers of camouflage netting. The air was marginally safer, but the tension was suffocating. Colonel Cates, A man whose uniform looked far too clean for the environment was hunched over a map, his face illuminated by a flickering lamp. He was desperate for clean intelligence. I was immediately hooked up to the main communication line, relaying messages not just for artillery, but for logistics, air support, and troop movements. I became the central nervous system of the 5th Division. The messages poured in, relentless, demanding. I was translating words of life and death. Hasty and TSOSI Thin Man, M4 Sherman Tank, requested fuel. ATSA, Eagle, F4U Corsair Fighter, requested coordinates for a bombing run. But the sheer volume of the incoming support was staggering. I was decoding requests for 10,000 gallons of fuel, 50 tons of high explosives, and the deployment of 2 fresh battalions arriving tomorrow morning. I was seeing the truth of the war, not from the foxhole, but from the ledger. I heard a code talker named Pete, relaying from a position farther down the beach. Dahiti, Crane, Destroyer, reports 4,000 rounds of 5-inch shell depleted, requesting immediate resupply. Supply ships are already waiting. I paused, momentarily disoriented by the figures. 4,000 rounds. Just from one destroyer. And they had immediate resupply. I looked at the map, covered with blue arrows pointing inexorably inland. The arrows never stopped moving. They were backed by an ocean full of ships, an air full of planes, and a continent full of factories working 3 shifts a day. I suddenly felt intensely alienated. The code was my power, my people's unique contribution, yet it was merely the fastest way to facilitate an industrial onslaught that was predetermined. We weren't winning the war with ingenuity. We were accelerating the inevitable destruction born from sheer volume. The Japanese, somewhere across the island, were fighting to the last man because they had no choice. They had no resupply. They had no Chedadahi, turtles, waiting in the wings, no endless supply of Jadholan and IH, buzzards, overhead. I realized my enemy wasn't the Japanese soldier in the tunnel. My enemy was arithmetic. And arithmetic was on our side, crushing them with cold, calculated efficiency, and I, Chayden Yazzie, was the voice translating that efficiency into fire. It was a bitter, cold epiphany. The relentless work continued for 12 hours without a break. My lips were cracked, my tongue felt swollen, and the constant hum of the radio had begun to merge with the pounding in my head. Colonel Cates was pacing, frantic. The Marines were bogged down near the western ridge. They needed a risky flanking maneuver. Suddenly, a priority message came through from Division Command, meant for the battalion commander, whose communications officer had been hit. It was addressed to the 2nd Battalion, which we coded as the Ajasher, Axe. I began translating the long, complex instruction. It was an order to pivot the battalion right and push through a narrow ravine, taking advantage of a momentary lapse in Japanese fire. I knew that ravine. Earlier, while monitoring enemy traffic, I had overheard, via an easily decoded Japanese broadcast, they never learned that the ravine was a trap, preceded by 2 heavy machine gun nests and linked by a tunnel network. Sending the Axe there was suicide. I was just the translator. I was the voice box. I was not the strategist. I looked at Colonel Cates, who was already waiting impatiently for the final clearance. He wouldn't understand if I tried to explain the nuance of a Japanese reconnaissance report I wasn't technically supposed to interpret. He would just see a Gook questioning a white officer's orders. I hesitated. My job was to transmit the command flawlessly and instantly. If I failed to transmit, men would be killed for dereliction of duty. If I transmitted, men would be killed by the enemy. Halt the order. The thought screamed in Dine Bizad. TSI to do. Absolutely not. I looked at Billy, who was cleaning his glasses, sensing my delay. He gave me a sharp, questioning look, the look of a warrior waiting for a command. I took a deep breath. My voice had to be pure. I chose to prioritize the code, the trust, the speed. I became the machine again. I transmitted the order for the Ajasher, axe, to move to the deadly coordinates. I used every specific directional word, Dua, north, Shadia, south, Haya, east, Ia, west, making the command utterly unambiguous. The moment the transmission ended, I felt sick. I had transmitted a death sentence, clothed in my sacred language. Kates clapped me lightly on the shoulder. "Fast work, Yazzie. That was critical." I looked out at the smoke-choked ridge. I didn't just pass on words, I passed on a verdict. The language that was supposed to protect us now served to accelerate the destruction of others, even those on our side, through the cold machinery of war. The battle raged into the night. The noise never truly stopped. It merely mutated into the deep, grinding sounds of distant shelling and the frantic calls of embedded radiomen. Billy and I took a brief moment of reprieve outside the tent, leaning against a pile of empty jerrycans. The night sky was brilliant, but the horizon glowed orange from the continuous fires consuming the lower slopes. "You transmitted that flank command quickly," Billy whispered, his voice hoarse. "That was a bad spot. I heard them discussing it before, too exposed." I nodded, staring at the fiery horizon. "It's not my decision, Billy. I'm just the conduit. You remember San Diego?" Billy asked abruptly, changing the subject. "That captain, the one who called us dirty savages when we first arrived?" I did. It was a common occurrence. The casual racism and deep-seated disdain from the very people we were fighting for. "He wouldn't look at us, even when we were in uniform. Said our language sounded like chicken squawking. Now, that chicken squawking is the only reason they haven't collapsed the entire front," I said bitterly. Just then, I picked up a faint, weak signal on a parallel frequency, a Japanese transmission, easily readable in standard cryptology. It was a field report being sent back to the remnants of the command structure. I translated it silently for Billy. The Japanese radioman wasn't talking about strategy or counterattacks. He was talking about rice rations running out, about wounds festering, and, most damningly, he was talking about the sheer, terrifying weight of the American logistical train. "They come like water," the Japanese voice crackled. "They do not stop. For every one we kill, 10 more appear. The sea is black with their ships. We have no food. We have no hope. It is not battle. It is arithmetic." I lowered the handset, the cold plastic stinging my cheek. "Did you hear that?" Billy asked, his voice low. "He said it's not battle. It's arithmetic," I repeated. That was the revelation. The crushing, undeniable truth. Our language was perfect, our code was inviolable, our courage was absolute. But none of it truly mattered in the grand, terrifying scale of things. We were the sharpest knife America had, but America also had 10 million other knives, and an infinite supply of steel to make more. The Japanese could never win because they had no steel supply waiting behind them. Their sacrifice was immense, but ultimately meaningless against the power of Detroit and Pittsburgh. The code was not the decisive factor. Industry was the decisive factor. My people's sacred tongue was reduced to a hyper-efficient tool in a cold, industrial massacre. We were saving American lives, yes, but we were primarily accelerating a victory that was already guaranteed by the sheer, overwhelming superiority of material resources. I was a master of the tongue, but a slave to the machine. And the machine was hungry. The third day of the invasion was focused entirely on taking the final ridges leading up to the summit of Mount Suribachi. Our position became untenable almost immediately. At dawn, the Japanese launched a frantic, disorganized, but utterly savage counterattack aimed directly at the temporary KP. They didn't care about surviving. They cared only about taking down the command structure. The fighting was up close and personal. Grenades exploded everywhere, and IMOS and flying thick and fast, and the air filled with the roar of rifles. Colonel Cates ordered an immediate, chaotic retreat toward the main line of the 4th Marine Division, farther up the slope. Billy and I grabbed the SCR-300. It was nearly impossible to move the heavy battery, and the radio set under fire. We scrambled over the smoking earth. A Japanese soldier, bayonet fixed, lunged from a hidden crevice directly at me. I barely had time to drop the radio and fire my M1 carbine, the shot deafeningly close. Billy, who was slightly ahead, paused to lay down suppressing fire. As he turned, a burst from a hidden Nambu raked the ground near him. He stumbled, then collapsed with a cry. "Billy!" I rushed to him. His left leg was bleeding profusely, a ragged tear just above the knee. The bone wasn't broken, but he couldn't walk. "Go! Get the radio up!" he gasped, clutching his thigh. "They're flanking us! We have to warn Dog Company about the tunnel exit." The SCR-300 was damaged. A chunk of shrapnel had torn through the outer casing of the battery pack. The antenna was bent at a grotesque angle. The main power source was dead. The only way to transmit was to use the emergency hand crank, manually generating power while simultaneously speaking. The rest of the KP staff had scattered, trying to fight their way out. We were alone, pinned down behind a shallow depression, 20 feet from a cluster of Japanese soldiers emerging from an unseen tunnel opening. I looked at Billy, then at the radio. If I paused to try and treat his wound, we would both die. If I stopped to try and fix the battery, the approaching Marines would be ambushed. I made the choice instantly. Survival depended on speed, not sentiment. The situation was pure chaos. Japanese voices were screaming, and the NICHA, fast shooter, was tearing up the ground around us. I placed the radio on a flat rock and secured the handset strap around my neck. I knelt next to Billy, who handed me his remaining clips. Tell them the tunnel is Yaitso, giant monster. Warn them of the flanking," Billy urged, his eyes glazed over with pain. I grabbed the crank with my left hand and the handset with my right. I had to turn the crank steadily while maintaining breath control and speaking clearly, all under a torrent of fire. I was transmitting the longest, most complicated message of my life: the coordinates of the tunnel exit, the flanking danger, and an urgent request for close air support, CAS, to be delivered almost on top of my own position. I began to crank the handle. The friction burned my palm. The tiny generator whined desperately. I started the transmission, not just with the standard code, but with an infusion of pure, emotional Dine Bizad, a stream of consciousness that merged military urgency with ancient ritual. Adine! Artillery! This is Ga, Recon, on Nahaz Nahati, Hot Island. Axis flanked by Yaitso, giant monster, at coordinates TLO and TLEZ, green grass, 9, Yaji, lamb, 5, Naatso Si, mouse, 1. We are 2, water and coast, cloud mixed. Need Jad Holon and IH, buzzards, now. Close. My voice rose, the sound ragged from fatigue and adrenaline. I wasn't just using the code, I was chanting it. I threw in words that had no military meaning, words for family, for protection, for the spirits of the mountains, a desperate, subconscious prayer woven into the technical data. I finished the transmission. The brief, clear burst of my voice, the unwritten prayer, was the only thing cutting through the static. I dropped the crank and grabbed my carbine, waiting for the inevitable charge. I was sure they had pinpointed my location. But before the Japanese could reach us, I heard it, the low, growing roar of approaching aircraft. Not just one or two, but a whole flight of ATSA, Eagles, the Corsairs diving low. The air support arrived with impossible speed. The ordnance slammed into the tunnel mouth and the surrounding positions. The roar of the explosions was so close, so immense, that it momentarily deafened me. The ground beneath us bucked violently. I was lifted by the concussion and thrown against the rock wall. When the noise subsided, there was a ringing silence, deeper and more profound than the one before the landing. The Japanese charge was neutralized. The Yaitse was silenced by the ATSA. I crawled over to Billy, who was gripping his rifle, his breathing shallow but steady. We were alive. We had succeeded. Not through a victory, but through an escape secured by the speed of our ancient tongue. The rest of the day was a blur of triage and mopping up. Suribachi was finally secured, and the iconic raising of the flag took place, though I barely registered it. Medics found us a few hours later. Billy was evacuated immediately. I was pulled out of the line, suffering from exhaustion, concussion, and minor shrapnel wounds. I was brought before Colonel Cates, who was setting up the permanent communications post on the newly secured summit. He looked like he had aged 10 years in 3 days. He offered me a cigarette, a rare gesture of personal respect. I took it, but my hands were shaking too badly to light it. "Yazzie," he said, his voice flat with fatigue. "That last transmission. The speed was unprecedented. You saved the axe. You saved us." He paused, looking at the black, ruined landscape. "When we finally looked at the decoded message, it was perfect. Clean. We wouldn't have been able to verify those tunnel coordinates with traditional means in time. You bought us 5 minutes. 5 minutes that cost them a whole company." He wasn't praising my courage. He was praising the efficiency of the code. "Thank you, sir," I managed to rasp. Cates leaned closer, his eyes intense. "Listen to me, Yazzie. You are leaving this island tomorrow. You and Johnson are being rotated out for RNR and security reasons." He lowered his voice further. "What you did here, what you all did, it stays here. Nobody, not your mother, not your brother, not your wife, is ever to know the details of this code. Not the words, not the system. You are to talk about the war in general terms. No specifics. This is classified above top secret. We cannot afford for this language to be corrupted, or for the enemy to even suspect its existence." The gratitude was immediately replaced by the cold, heavy hand of state secrecy. My greatest accomplishment, the thing that had allowed me to survive, was now to be my biggest silence. I nodded, the smoke from the cigarette tasting like ash and metal. "I understand, sir." "Good, Yazzie. You're a hero. A silent one." I watched the American flag ripple in the wind atop Suribachi. It was a symbol of victory, paid for with the lives of thousands of men, secured by the secret language of a people America had tried to erase. I was being sent home, burdened not by a loss, but by a victory I could never claim. 2 years later, I was back in the vast, silent land of the Navajo Nation. I walked the familiar red earth of the reservation. The air was dry and clean, smelling of juniper and cedar smoke, a world away from the sulfur and blood of Iwo Jima. I married a girl from my clan. We had a small hogan. I tried to live a normal life. But the war had not left me. The war had merely gone silent, retreating into the deepest crevices of my mind. When the elders asked me about the war, about my time in the uniform, I could only speak vaguely about ships, planes, and heat. I couldn't tell them how their language, the language of the mountains and the spirits, had been used to describe B-29s, Tsa-ZIH, the large owl, and flamethrowers, Wallachii, ants for their quick, burning movements. I saw Billy Johnson occasionally. We would sit and share a smoke silent. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was mandated. It was the burden of the oath we had taken, the burden of the code. We were famous for our service in the Marines, but the true nature of that service was completely invisible. I watched America transition into peacetime. The heroes were celebrated, the pilots, the generals, the soldiers who raised the flag. I watched as the same government that depended on our perfect code continued to treat my people with systemic neglect and racism, denying us voting rights in some states, restricting our land, and forgetting our children in poorly funded schools. The irony was a crushing weight. We had saved the Pacific Theater, yet we couldn't save ourselves from bureaucratic indifference. Our language was deemed strategically perfect, but our people were deemed socially imperfect. I often thought about the Japanese radioman's last message. It is not battle, it is arithmetic. Our code was essential because it was fast. But speed merely meant fewer American deaths and a quicker resolution to an already mathematically sealed fate. Our greatest act of patriotism was completely detached from our reward, our recognition, or our dignity. Decades passed. Billy passed away, taking the full weight of his silence with him. I became an elder, listening to the young people speak the language, often mixing in English words, diluting the purity that had once been weaponized. Then, 1968. The classification was finally lifted. Not with a celebration, but with a quiet, administrative order. The newspapers published a small article. The Navajo Code Talkers, Secret Heroes of the Pacific. It felt strange, hearing the official voice of America confirm the truth I had lived with for 23 years. But still, the recognition was slow. The awards didn't come immediately. It wasn't until the early 2000s, when I was an old man, that the full measure of our service was acknowledged, with medals and ceremonies. When I received the Congressional Gold Medal, I stood on the podium, looking at the blinding lights and the politicians, and I thought back to the burning black sand of Iwo Jima. I remembered the scent of sulfur, the sound of the desperate crank, and the urgent, unwritten prayer I had chanted into the static. The code was no longer a secret. It was a monument to the power of a culture that survived, and a cold reminder of the price of silence. The language of the people, Dine Bizad, had not just survived a war, it had won one, only to wait half a century to tell the tale. The only true reward was that the language survived. That was the only victory that mattered.